The first thing I remember is the color of the dirt in that ravine. It was packed tight and dry, the kind of pale brown that turns almost gray under harsh midday sun, and in the middle of it there was a narrow wound in the earth cut straight down like someone had sliced a line through time. The wind funneled low along the rock walls, carrying the faint rattle of loose gravel and the creak of old pines leaning over the edge, and every sound seemed too sharp, too clear. Down in that cut, two thin arches of bone curved up out of the soil, almost touching as if the ground itself was trying to pull them back in. There was rope still wrapped around what remained of them, fibers flattened and stubborn, and a single strip of fabric fluttered in the breeze like it wanted to rise but couldn't quite remember how. Someone's camera clicked behind me, a small metallic pop that echoed off the rock and felt wrong in a place that quiet. The air smelled like dust and cold stone and something older I couldn't name, and even though there were people all around me, I had the strangest feeling that the ravine was paying attention. I didn't say a word. I just stood there staring at that narrow hole in the earth, and the way those bones leaned against each other as if they had been left that way on purpose. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I live in a small house just outside Kalispell now, down a gravel road where the dust hangs in the air behind every truck that rattles past. Most mornings that summer I woke up before sunrise out of habit, the way I did when I still wore the ranger patch and carried a radio on my hip. The house is nothing special. One-story, low-roof, old pine boards that creak in the hallway, but the front porch faces east. And if you sit there with a cup of black coffee, you can watch the first light brush along the distant outline of Glacier's peaks. On clear days, the sky starts off that soft powder blue you only get in dry mountain air, and you can hear the hum of tires over asphalt as the early commuters head down toward town. Sprinklers chatter in the neighbors' yards. A dog barks 2 houses over, and the smell of fresh-cut grass mixes with the faint resin of sun-warmed pine. That's the rhythm I was living in back then, coffee on the porch, old habits I couldn't quite give up, and the mountains sitting on the horizon like a promise I still believed in. I was a few years into retirement, but it didn't feel like retirement in the way people talk about it. I still drove my old park truck some days, even though the emblem had been scraped off the doors, and I still kept a stack of worn topographic maps in the glove box. I'd find excuses to swing by the ranger station, drop off muffins, ask about snowpack, pretend I needed to borrow a field guide just to hear the radio squawk and smell that familiar mix of wet gear, coffee, and pine needles. The younger rangers would grin and say "Morning, Henry" in that respectful way people talk to someone who's put in his years, and I'd nod like I was just passing through. Truth was, after decades watching the weather roll in over those ridges, it's hard to teach yourself to stop looking at the sky. Even at home, if the wind shifted or the clouds stacked up strange over the park, I'd step out onto the porch and stand there until my shoulders finally loosened again. Hannah and Claire rented a little house on the north side of town that summer, maybe 15 minutes from me if the lights cooperated. It was one of those small, older places college kids seem to gravitate to: peeling white paint, a sagging front step, mismatched lawn chairs in the yard. The porch light was always a little too bright, an old bulb that hummed faintly when it was quiet at night, and a faded welcome mat sagged in the middle from too many boots scraping dirt off. Inside, it smelled like coffee potting soil and the faint citrus of cheap dish soap. They kept wildflower prints taped to the walls, and their old hiking boots lined up by the back door, dried mud still clinging to the soles, like a second map of where they'd been. There were always tote bags and field notebooks scattered across the table, laptop cords snaking across the floor, and a camera lens sitting on a counter like someone had just set it down in the middle of a thought. Hannah moved through that little house like she was always on the edge of heading out again. She talked with her hands, fingers stained faintly green from leaves or pencil smudges, and she carried a notebook everywhere inside of it, filled with sketches of leaves, stems, and half-legible Latin names. She had just finished her degree in biology, but still treated every roadside ditch like it might be hiding something rare, bending down to brush her fingertips along stems, or kneel in the dirt to study a petal. Her hair was always pulled back in a loose knot, wisps escaping when she got excited and forgot about everything else. If you listened close, you could hear the scratch of her pencil late into the night, even after the house had gone quiet and the neighborhood had settled into the steady hush of sleeping televisions and air conditioners. Claire was the quieter of the two, but it wasn't a shy quiet. It was the kind that watches everything and files it away. She'd be the one behind the camera at family cookouts framing the shot instead of stepping into it, checking the light on the screen with her brow furrowed in concentration. Her degree was in environmental science, but she'd fallen hard for photography somewhere along the way, and their living room shelves were full of hard drives and memory cards lined up in little labeled cases. If you sat with her on the back steps in the evening, she'd point out how the light shifted color along the rims of the clouds, or how the shadows moved through the tree line, noticing things most of us only feel. The soft click of her camera shutter was as much a part of that house as the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old floorboards. They were twins, but not in that storybook way where you can't tell one from the other. They shared the same straight nose and the same dark eyes, yes, but their energy ran in different directions. Hannah burned bright and fast words, spilling out faster than she could always catch them. Claire moved slower, more deliberate, like she was always one step ahead in her head. Still, when they walked down a trail side by side, matching packs on their shoulders, it was like watching two versions of the same idea move through the world. People would glance twice: cashiers, tourists, the old-timers at the diner, trying to decide if they were sisters or just strangely similar friends. They never seemed to mind. They'd just grin at each other in that way only siblings do, a private joke passing between them without a word. The town that summer felt like it always does in July, busy but familiar. Tourists poured in rental SUVs with out-of-state plates, filling the motel lots and lining up at the gas stations. In the afternoons, you could smell sunscreen and hot asphalt in the grocery store parking lot, mingled with the sharp, clean scent of ice from bags tumbling into coolers. Locals did what locals always do. We grumbled about the traffic, the long lines at the lake access, the time it took to get through town when the train rolled through at the wrong hour. But there was a kind of pride in it, too, knowing that people drove halfway across the country just to see the mountains we woke up under every day. At night, when the day trippers had gone back to their hotels, Kalispell settled into a softer rhythm, patio lights flickering on the distant thump of music from a bar downtown, a train horn, low and mournful as it slid along the valley. I saw Hannah and Claire a lot that summer. We'd meet at a little diner off Main, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that's never great, but somehow always hits the spot. They'd come in wearing worn jeans and T-shirts that smelled faintly of smoke and pine hair, pulled back boots still dusty from whatever trail they'd been on last. They'd spread out their maps across the table, pushing aside napkin dispensers and sugar packets, tracing lines with their fingertips as they talked over each other about ridges and creeks and flowers that supposedly only grew above a certain elevation. The overhead lights hummed, the air conditioner rattled, and the smell of bacon and burnt toast clung to everything, but their eyes were always on the contour lines and the tiny blue streams. I'd sip my coffee and listen, that old ranger part of me half proud and half wary, measuring distances and hazards in my head while they talked about beauty. They'd grown up in those mountains with me. I'd taken them on their first overnight trip when they were 9 tiny packs on their shoulders, their laughter echoing between the trees as we crossed the footbridges. They learned early how to set a tent before the rain hit, how to hang a food bag, how to tell when a storm was building just by the way the treetops moved. We had our rituals, singing old songs on the last mile before camp, making hot chocolate. Even in July, flipping a coin to see who had to dig the latrine. Those memories smell like wood smoke and damp wool to me, the crackle of a fire, the hiss of rain on canvas, the scratch of pine needles under my sleeping bag. Back then, when they fell asleep side by side in their sleeping bags, soft breathing in the dark, I never once imagined a time when the mountains might hold anything for them but wonder. That July in 2016, they were between things. School was done, but the next steps hadn't fully taken shape yet. There were job applications out there, unanswered emails, maybe a semester of grad school on the horizon if the pieces fell into place. In the meantime, they were making the most of the open days, short trips, day hikes, hours spent sorting photos and specimens at their kitchen table with the fan turning lazily overhead. Sometimes I'd stop by unannounced, bringing over leftovers or an extra pie from a church bake sale. I'd find them sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of field guides and memory cards, the smell of reheated coffee and something slightly burnt drifting from the kitchen. One afternoon, I remember Hannah waving me over to the table, her notebook open to a photocopy of an old yellowed plant map. The corners were curled, and the ink had faded to this soft brown, but she had circled a note in the margin with fresh blue pen. "Look at this," she said, tapping the name of a late-blooming sunflower species that had been flagged as rare decades ago. She talked about elevation ranges and soil types, about how conditions had shifted, and where it might still be clinging on her words running together in that way that meant she'd been thinking about it for days. Claire stood behind her camera strap, hanging from her fingers, nodding along, already picturing how she'd capture it if they found it in bloom. The house smelled like damp paper and lemon cleaner, and outside a lawnmower droned somewhere down the block, steady and distant. I felt a little prickle of something in my chest that day, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Maybe it was the age of that map, older than they were by a long stretch, or the way the ink had bled from too many years in someone's pack before it ever made its way into theirs. Maybe it was the way Hannah said, "Nobody's really been up in that drainage for years," with a spark in her eyes that I recognized from my own younger days. Claire laughed and called it forgotten country in that soft, amused way of hers, like the phrase tasted good in her mouth. I heard the words, and I heard something else under them, empty space on the map, miles of ground where help doesn't come quickly. Still, I only nodded and told them the usual things. A father tells his grown daughters, "Log your route, check your weather, carry more water than you think you need." The week they started talking seriously about a 3-day loop, the heat settled in, thick over the valley. The air in town felt heavy, the kind that makes shirts cling to your back by noon, and the sky over the park shimmered with a pale, dry haze. At the grocery store, the coolers rattled like they were working too hard, and the smell of dust rose every time a cart rolled across the parking lot. Even the river looked slower when I drove past it on my way into town, green-gray and glassy under the sun. Hannah complained that the heat was making her plants wilt before she could get them pressed. Claire said the light was too harsh midday, flattening the ridges in her photos. They said it with a kind of affection, though like they knew the landscape well enough to forgive its moods. One evening, a few days before they were set to head out, they came by my place for dinner. We ate on the back deck, paper plates balanced on our knees, the smell of grilled chicken and charcoal hanging in the still air. Crickets had just started up in the tall grass by the fence, that soft, steady chorus that means summer's in full stride. They told me again about the route they were planning, where they'd leave the car, which drainage they'd follow, how they'd cut across to hit a less-used creek. The sun dropped behind the pines, and the sky went from gold to that deep blue that holds onto the last light longer than you expect. I watched them talk, their faces animated in the glow from the porch light, and for a moment the only thing I felt was gratitude that they loved the same land that had shaped my whole life. Later that night, after they'd driven away in their little Subaru taillights disappearing down my dust-covered road, I stood by the kitchen window longer than usual. The house was quiet. The clock over the stove ticking louder than it had any right to, and the air felt just a touch cooler against my bare forearms. Out back, the deck chairs sat empty, the grill lid closed, a thin line of smoke still curling up into the dark. I glanced at the phone on the counter. its screen black, and thought about calling them just to remind them of one more thing, some small piece of advice I'd already given 100 times. Instead, I set it face down, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet in the familiar pattern they always had. Behind me, through the window, the porch light burned on a little longer than usual, casting a pale circle on the empty gravel, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain. The silence in that small house felt heavier than it should have. I remember the morning it began, how ordinary it looked at first, how nothing in the light or the air warned me that the world had already shifted. The sun came up pale and steady over the pines the same way it always did in late July, and the road outside my place was still damp from the night's sprinklers. I stood on the porch with my mug warming my hands, listening to the quiet hum of insects waking in the grass and the low hush of a truck somewhere in the distance. It should have been a peaceful start to the day, but there was a thin, restless feeling under my ribs, the kind that made me check my phone twice before I even finished my coffee. They were supposed to send a short check-in before breaking camp. Nothing elaborate, just a quick, all good, or a photo of the creek they were following. When the screen stayed dark, I told myself they were probably climbing into higher elevation and the signal was patchy. That kind of thing happens all the time up here. Still, I kept glancing toward the phone as if the next vibration might settle something inside me. By mid-morning, I tried calling both of them, not because I was worried yet, but because that quiet, prickling feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. The calls went straight to voicemail, each one ending with the same soft click and the echo of my own breath in the silence that followed. I stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for the bars to flicker or for one of the signal icons to flare, but the phone stayed as still as a stone. The house felt too quiet. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to sink lower into the background, like the air was bracing for something. I walked from room to room, not sure what I was looking for, some clue they'd sent, before leaving something they might have forgotten to mention. But everything in that house was exactly as it had been. The faded rug, the stack of mail by the door, the smell of coffee grounding the morning in something familiar. Around noon, I tried again. And again. Each call felt a little heavier, and each silence afterward lasted a little too long. I finally sent a message to their satellite device, a short, simple line asking for their status, the same kind of message we'd always exchanged when they were on longer routes. Normally, I'd get something back within minutes, those tiny bursts of reassurance that traveled through the sky and landed like a warm hand on the shoulder. This time, nothing came through. The heat outside had built up by then, turning the air thick enough to taste dust on the breeze when I stepped onto the porch. My shirt stuck slightly to my back, and I found myself listening hard for the faint chime of a notification that never came. I drove into town early that afternoon, hoping the change of scenery would shake off the unease. The pavement shimmered in the heat, stretching out like a sheet of glass, and I had to keep the windows cracked to let the breeze bring in the smell of pine and hot asphalt. Kalispell was in its usual summer rhythm, tourists clustering outside the ice cream shop, kids running through the splash pad by the church, older couples sitting on benches in the shade with soft cups of lemonade. Nothing in town reflected the churn in my stomach. I parked in front of the diner where I'd met the girls so many times. I even ordered coffee, though I didn't drink much of it. I kept checking the phone on the table, its black screen reflecting the overhead lights like a closed eye. I told myself not to overthink it. They were smart, experienced, cautious. They'd grown up in those mountains. They weren't the type to get turned around or wander off trail without marking their route. But the more I repeated those truths, the more they felt like phrases I was using to hold myself together, not explanations. By mid-afternoon, with no message and no return call, I drove over to their rental house. The neighborhood was quiet, an empty lawn chair tipped over by the fence, a dog barking faintly 2 streets away, the warm scent of sun-baked pavement rolling through the open truck window. When I stepped onto their porch, the boards creaked under my boots in that familiar way, But the house didn't have its usual hum. The curtains were drawn, and a thin film of dust coated the windowsill enough to make me realize they'd been gone longer than it felt. I walked around the house, once a slow circle that gave me too much time to think. Their garden hose lay coiled in the grass like a forgotten piece of rope, and a plant they'd been tending near the back steps had wilted slightly, its leaves curled from heat. I crouched down and touched the soil. It was dry as flour. That small detail bothered me in a way I couldn't name. They never forgot to water their plants before a trip, even a short one. Something in that simple oversight seemed out of rhythm with who they were. But again, I told myself they were just rushed that morning, excited to get on the trail before the traffic built. That was all. By 4 o'clock, I couldn't pretend any longer. I sent another satellite message, then another. Each time the device confirmed it had gone through, but nothing came back. The sky had shifted slightly, a faint haze drifting down from higher elevations, softening the outline of the mountains in the distance. It wasn't smoke, it was too light for that, but it had the same unsettling way of bending the light just enough to make the world look unfamiliar. I paced the porch for a while, the boards warm under my boots, the smell of pine resin drifting from the trees lining the yard. I tried calling Ellen. She listened quiet at first, then told me not to jump to conclusions. They were probably still in the high country. They'd check in as soon as they cleared the ridge. But even as she said the words, I could hear the small crack of worry edging into her voice. I drove home slower than usual, rolling the windows down to let the warm wind blow into the cab. It carried the scent of dust and dry grass, the faint sweetness of summer fields, and underneath that something still and heavy that made me tighten my grip on the steering wheel. When I pulled into my driveway, I kept the engine running for a moment longer than necessary, staring through the windshield at the darkening outline of the pines. The porch light clicked on automatically, spilling a soft pool of gold across the gravel, and something about that familiar glow made the silence feel even sharper. I tried one last time to call them before I went inside. I listened to the ring, the long pause, the quiet breath before the voicemail picked up. I stood under the porch light phone pressed to my ear, moths flickering in and out of the glow, and realized I was holding my breath. When the call dropped, a kind of cold settled in my chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just the sense that something had slipped sideways, something small but undeniable. Inside, the house was stuffy from the afternoon heat. I opened a window to let in the cooling air, listening to the soft rattle of the screen as a breeze pushed through. I set the phone on the counter where I could see it from every angle, and for a while I just stood there, palms pressed to the cool surface, staring at the reflection of the dim kitchen light. There was no good reason for them to miss that many check-ins. None. I'd taught them better. They'd lived it. All three of us knew what those mountains demanded in terms of communication. Around 7, the sky took on that deepening blue that always comes just before full dark. Crickets started up in the grass, their slow, steady rhythm filling the yard. I stepped back outside, needing air. The gravel shifted softly under my boots, and the smell of cool earth began to replace the heat of the day. I walked down to the edge of the road, looking both directions as if a pair of headlights might appear unexpectedly the way they sometimes had when the girls dropped by unannounced. But the road stayed empty. Far off, I heard a single engine on the highway, low and steady, but it faded quickly, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the faint whir of the porch light. I turned toward the house, and for a brief second I thought I saw movement through the front window, a shadow shifting. My heart kicked once hard. But when I looked closer, it was just the curtains stirring in the open window, pushed by the cooling air. Still, that moment lingered in my chest, a reminder of how the mind reaches for things when the world stops making sense. I went back inside, closed the door behind me, and stood in the kitchen, listening to the old clock above the stove tick its slow, patient beat. Each second seemed louder than the last. I dialed their satellite device again, sent another message, then another. Nothing came back. The phone screen glowed in the dim room, casting a pale rectangle of light across the countertop. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point I became aware of a faint sound outside, gravel shifting under tires. Slow, careful. I moved toward the window, heart beating in a tight, unsteady rhythm. A pair of headlights eased into view, sweeping across the yard in a soft arc of pale yellow before settling still. A sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop at the edge of my driveway. The engine idled for a moment low and even, and then a door opened with a soft thud. A silhouette stepped out, one hand lifting to remove a hat. The porch light caught the edge of the figure, turning the brim into a thin line of gold. I didn't move. I just watched through the window as the deputy took a slow breath and started up the path toward my door, each step crunching faintly on the gravel in the quiet Montana night. When the deputy stepped onto my porch that night, the gravel still shifting under his boots, I knew before he spoke that the worry inside me had crossed a line. His face was dimly lit by the porch light, features softened, but his posture, hat in one hand, shoulders slightly drawn, told me this was no routine check. He asked a few quiet questions when I'd last heard from them, what route they'd planned, whether there was any chance they'd changed their itinerary without mentioning it. His voice was low, steady, but I could hear the careful little pauses he took before each next question, the kind that come when someone already suspects the answer won't be good. When he finally nodded and said he'd notify the ranger district, the words settled in my chest with a cold finality. My daughters were now officially overdue. By sunrise the next morning, my driveway was full of movement. Trucks idled with their engines humming, radios crackled with half-coherent chatter, and the early mountain light threw long, pale streaks across the dirt. I recognized a few of the rangers climbing out of their vehicles, men and women I'd trained years earlier, now older, more seasoned. They greeted me with quiet nods, their faces somber, their expressions carrying that mix of determination and worry familiar to anyone who's worked a missing person call. The air smelled like diesel dust and the faint sharpness of the morning's chill. Someone unfolded a map on the hood of a truck, weighing down the corners with thermoses and a flashlight, and the ink lines I'd traced with my daughters only days earlier stared back at me like a promise I couldn't undo. We headed toward the trailhead in a slow convoy. The sun was fully up by then, lighting the tops of the trees in a warm gold that didn't match the heaviness in the cab of my truck. I rode with one of the younger deputies, and neither of us spoke much. The only sound was the steady roll of tires on asphalt and the occasional buzz of his radio. When we reached the lot, their Subaru sat exactly where it should have been. Doors locked, windows slightly dusted over from the breeze that sweeps that corner of the park in the summer. Seeing it there untouched sent a shock through me. I'd hoped for something else, even if it was unreasonable. The silence around that parked car felt unnatural, like the air was holding its breath. At the trailhead, the search began in those slow, methodical steps I knew so well from my ranger days. A K-9 team unloaded their gear, the dogs whining softly with eagerness as handlers clipped their harnesses. Rangers spread out topo maps and divided the terrain into manageable sectors. The sheriff briefed everyone with a voice that carried across the clearing. 2 missing hikers experienced last known position. Uncertain expected return date missed. His tone was professional, but I caught the flicker in his eyes when he glanced toward me, a mixture of sympathy and resolve. The kind that stings even when you know it's meant kindly. We moved out along the trail in small groups. The air warmed quickly, carrying the smell of sun-heated soil and sap. My boots pressed into familiar ground, the dust rising in small puffs with each step. I scanned the edges of the path, the way I had done 1,000 times as a ranger, looking for anything out of place, a broken stem, an overturned stone, the faint depression of a footprint. For a while, the only sounds were birds calling in the canopy and the soft rustle of underbrush brushed by passing boots. The forest was alive and indifferent, the same as it had always been. When we reached a point near the creek crossing, a dog gave a faint alert, just enough to make everyone freeze. The handler kneeled studying the ground with narrowed eyes. There was a faint impression in the mud, a partial sole, maybe a boot tread. But the shape wasn't crisp, and the mud had dried unevenly. "Could have belonged to anyone," he said, voice low. "Could have been days old, washed and distorted by the water." The hope that had flickered for a heartbeat squeezed shut like a fist. Farther up the drainage, the trail grew thinner and more rugged. The forest canopy thickened, dimming the sunlight until it came down in broken shafts that made dust float like drifting sparks in the air. Every few minutes, someone's radio would crackle with static and a clipped message, Sector 3, clear, or no sign on the ridge. Each report landed in the pit of my stomach like a stone. The dogs worked hard, noses low, tails stiff with focus. At one point, a handler signaled again, this time near a bend in the stream where the water widened into a shallow pool. The dogs caught a scent, brief, then gone. They circled, puzzled. The handler muttered something about the way wind tunnels through that area, how it can pull scent down the gully before scattering it. Still seeing those animals confused shook me. Dogs don't bluff. They don't pretend. By midday, the sun lay heavy on our shoulders. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and the smell of wet earth rose from the creek bed every time we crossed it. We reached the area where the girls had planned to camp, and the sight of that small clearing stopped me cold. Their tent stood where they normally would have pitched it, neatly placed stakes well driven. The rainfly half open as if someone had stepped out for a moment. But the inside, that hurt to look at. Bedrolls unzipped, a couple of wrappers, left out a cooking pot overturned in the dirt as though someone had dropped it mid-task. Nothing violent, nothing obviously wrong, but out of rhythm. That was the part that chilled me. The layout was wrong in a way only someone who knew them would recognize. Rangers photographed everything, their cameras clicking steadily, the whir audible even over the quiet murmur of the creek. Someone lifted one of the backpacks, feeling its weight, and set it down gently with a small shake of his head. All gear accounted for. Clothes still folded, logs undisturbed. It looked like they had walked away of their own free will, but no one said that out loud. Too many years in the field had taught us that the forest can mask the truth just as easily as it preserves it. Maps came out again, spread over a fallen log this time. Lines were drawn, distances calculated. A ranger ran his finger along a contour, noting how the terrain rose sharply into ridges that twisted like knuckles above the stream. We divided again and pressed deeper. The forest grew quieter as the afternoon light shifted. Less birdsong, now more of that muted, breathless stillness that settles in the backcountry when the heat softens and the shadows start to lengthen. I found myself pausing every few minutes, listening, expecting something. A shout, a whistle, a laugh carried on the air. Anything. But the forest kept its silence. Later that afternoon, a couple of volunteers from Seattle joined the effort after hearing about the girls on the radio. They recognized Hannah and Claire from a chance meeting at a communal fire the night before the girls headed up the drainage. They described them in gentle tones, one talking excitedly about plants, the other snapping photos of the stars. Small details, friendly, ordinary. It was meant to reassure, but all it did was sharpen the ache in my chest. They'd been alive and well just days before, and now there was nothing. Rumors began forming even before the first day's search ended. At the trailhead, as the light faded, I overheard two hikers discussing an old story about sacred ground hidden somewhere in the high country, a place you weren't supposed to disturb. Someone else mentioned hearing an engine late at night up near an unmarked ridge road, said it was odd for anyone to be up there that time of year. The sheriff brushed off the talk, but the glances exchanged between some of the older locals told me they'd heard those stories before. Maybe they didn't believe them entirely, but they carried them the way people in small towns hold on to half-remembered warnings. By the time we wrapped the first day's efforts, dusk had taken hold. The air cooled quickly, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint sweetness of distant wildflowers. I leaned against my truck for a moment, letting my forehead rest on the warm metal. My legs felt heavy, and my throat burned from the dry air, but it was the weight behind my ribs that made it hard to breathe. One of the younger rangers walked over with a bottle of water and started to say something, but he stopped when he saw my face. He just set the bottle beside me and walked away, boots crunching softly on the gravel. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay on the couch, the windows open to let in the thin night breeze. The sound of wind pushing through the pine branches outside drifted in a slow, steady hush that almost felt like breathing. Every few minutes, a passing car sent a wash of light across the ceiling, then left the room dark again. My phone sat on the coffee table screen, facing up, glowing faintly whenever it caught the headlights. I must have reached for it 24 times, checking for missed calls, messages, anything. At dawn, I was back in the ranger lot before most of the others. The sky was a soft blue-gray streaked with the first thin blush of sunrise, and the air smelled like damp dirt and cooling engines. Volunteers arrived with backpacks slung over shoulders, adjusting straps and sipping coffee from metal tumblers. A helicopter thudded low over the valley, its blades chopping the morning air in slow, rhythmic pulses. I watched it circle, then bank toward the ridge before disappearing beyond the tree line. When the sheriff came over with the day's plan, he carried himself a shade heavier. Shoulders, lower pace, slower. He talked through sectors, routes, likely water sources, known hazards. His finger paused over a steep ravine where the satellite message had last pinged, a small wrinkle forming between his brows as he measured the terrain. They'd grid search every inch of it today, he said. Conditions would be tricky. The footing loose, visibility poor. But it was the next logical place. We set out again, boots hitting the dirt in steady rhythm. Radios crackled occasionally, mostly check-ins, no findings. The forest felt different that day. The shadows stretched longer, and even the birds seemed quieter, as though waiting. Midway up the slope, a deputy called out that he'd found something near the water's edge. We rushed over, hearts ready to leap at any scrap of hope. It was a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, sun-bleached, frayed, the color difficult to read. A ranger inspected it, rubbing the material between his fingers, and shook his head. Wrong type, wrong size, likely from an old tent lost years ago. The hope that had risen in my chest collapsed with a dull ache. Hours passed like that, momentary flickers of possibility swallowed by long stretches of empty ground. My legs grew stiff, my throat dry. But I kept going. We all did. Every time I paused, I'd find myself staring into the trees, imagining their faces, hearing their voices. Then I'd push forward again. Late that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind a ridge, turning the forest floor into a wash of amber and shadow, one of the rangers signaled to the group at the map table. His expression was tight, unreadable, but there was something in the way he held a small object in his hand, careful, almost reverent, that made my stomach drop before I even reached him. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and for the first time since the search began, I saw something in a ranger's face that frightened me more than silence. He opened his palm just enough that I could see a sliver of what he'd found, something too clean, too deliberate to be explained away by wind or water. And just like that, the entire search shifted the air around us, tightening in a way I still remember to this day, even if we didn't yet understand what that tiny object meant. The ranger who'd signaled us over was standing perfectly still, as if any movement might disturb whatever he held in the palm of his hand. The sunlight filtered through the lodgepole pines in thin, slanted bands, catching on the dust hanging in the air and turning everything around us into a muted haze. When I reached him, he didn't open his hand right away. He just looked at me with a tightness around his mouth I'd only ever seen on scenes involving real loss. His radio crackled on his shoulder, 2 clipped words I couldn't make out, and then he finally lifted his palm. It wasn't much, just a narrow strip of cloth, pale frayed at one end and folded in on itself like it had been torn free. but I recognized it instantly. It was the same pattern my girls had stitched onto their packs years earlier, a bit of bright fabric to help them tell their gear apart in a crowded trailhead. Seeing it there, pinched between the ranger's fingers, knocked the breath clean out of me. The sheriff called for the area to be flagged, and the quiet that fell over the search team was unlike anything I'd heard in all my years on the job. No murmurs, no shifting boots, just the wind moving through the branches carrying that scent of dry pine and cold rock. A deputy stepped in, lifted the cloth carefully into an evidence bag, and held it up to the light. Dust shimmered around his hands like tiny motes of ash. The weight of that small thing was unbearable. It meant they'd been here somewhere close. It meant we weren't chasing ghosts. We reoriented the search and moved deeper into the drainage following the slope as it tightened into a steeper run of fractured stone. My legs felt heavier with every step, as though the earth itself resisted us going forward. The air cooled sharply as we descended, carrying a mineral smell, the scent of old rock and still water. Radios lit up across the ridge above us. New instructions, a new grid. Every voice carried a strain, even when the words stayed clipped and professional. I followed two rangers down into a narrow gully veiled by overgrown shrubs. The ground softened under our boots, the kind of damp soil that remembered footprints far longer than the harder terrain above. The light dimmed as the walls rose on either side, turning the air colder, almost metallic. A dog barked once in the distance, a sharp, echoing sound that bounced around the rock faces like a trapped bird. Someone shouted for everyone to hold position. Then another voice followed, quieter but firm, saying they'd found something buried. I felt my stomach drop as though the ground had tilted. We moved toward the call slowly, carefully, each footstep deliberate. The ravine opened into a small depression, a shallow basin of pale dirt and scattered stone. A group had gathered around a spot near the center, their bodies forming a loose ring of dark silhouettes against the brighter sky above. One of the rangers held a GPS unit that beeped softly in his hand, marking the coordinates. Another knelt over a faint disturbance in the soil, a smooth oval patch where the earth had settled in a different texture, almost like a long-forgotten footprint of time itself. I stood at the edge of the circle, unable to move closer, listening to the brittle crackle of drying leaves under someone's boots. The sheriff gave the order for a slow, careful dig. Everyone stepped back except two rangers trained in excavation men who knew how to brush aside layers of earth without disturbing what lay beneath. They worked in disciplined silence, a trowel scraping lightly, a soft brush sweeping. The wind made the dry branches rattle overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called a long, lonely sound that hung in the air. The first shape appeared at only a few inches down. A piece of bone, the curve of a hand fragile and unmistakable even under the dust. I felt my body lock up, every muscle turning to stone. Someone whispered to alert the sheriff, and a deputy stepped back with trembling breath. The second ranger continued brushing the soil away. More bone. Another curve. Then the faint outline of a narrow shoulder still pressed against another. Two bodies. Upright, bound together. The world around me narrowed to a single point of cold clarity. My hearing dimmed like someone had placed cotton in my ears. The air was dry, but I could swear I tasted something metallic on my tongue, fear maybe, or the weight of understanding settling in. A ranger reached gently into the pit fingertips, brushing against a length of rope that still held its structure fibers woven tight despite the years. It wasn't nylon. It wasn't even something that should have been in that mountain range at all. Its texture was coarse, plant-based, unfamiliar against the gloved hand that lifted it. I felt myself step forward without meaning to my boots, scraping lightly on the loose stone. A deputy touched my arm. Not hard, just steady, but I barely registered it. All I could see was the way those two bodies rested back to back, as though the earth had swallowed them mid-embrace. Their clothes clung to them in faint tatters, the fabric preserved in ways I didn't understand. The soil around their ribs had shifted enough for the light to catch on the bone itself, revealing darkened lines etched deep into each side, patterns, deliberate markings. Even from where I stood, I could sense they weren't natural. One of the investigators leaned closer, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. "This is recent," he murmured. "Not ancient, not accidental." My knees felt weak. They worked through the afternoon, unearthing the bodies inch by inch until the full picture stood clear. The ravine stayed quiet throughout, as though the mountain itself refused to speak. When they lifted the remains onto stretcher boards, slowly, with a level of reverence, I will never forget the wrapped rope still looped their torsos, binding them back to back. The sight hit me so hard I had to steady myself against a tree. The bark pressed rough and cold into my palm, grounding me in a world that suddenly felt unreal. For a long time, no one said my daughter's names out loud. Not until the evidence bags were sealed and the remains taken up the slope toward the helicopter waiting on the ridge. Not until the sheriff stood beside me in the thinning light with his hat clutched in both hands, the breeze teasing the brim. His voice was low and even, though he spoke gently. The words felt like they carved straight through my chest. He told me they would need DNA to confirm. Protocol, procedure. But he didn't need to say what both of us already knew. The location matched their last signal. The insignia on the scraps of fabric matched their gear, and the bodies were two young women of the right size, the right age. His eyes softened, the kind of softness you only see when someone wishes more than anything that they didn't have to tell you what they just did. The discovery triggered a wave of activity. More deputies arrived, the county coroner, a team from the bureau. They marked every inch of the ravine with small orange flags that fluttered like uneasy birds in the breeze. They set up portable lights even before the sun dipped behind the ridge, their beams slicing through the growing dusk in harsh white arcs. Generators hummed. Radios clicked and crackled. The air filled with the faint scent of gasoline and disturbed soil. I watched them work with a numbness that bordered on dreamlike. They combed the area for footprints, for debris, for anything that didn't belong. At one point, an agent lifted a small copper charm from the earth, a feather-shaped pendant dulled by age and dirt. Another held up a crude stone blade with strips of weathered hide wrapped around the handle. Their faces pinched with confusion. Every new object seemed older than it had any right to be, and yet too well preserved to dismiss as relics. When an anthropologist arrived and examined the rib markings more closely, her expression darkened. She whispered to another specialist, and for the first time since the excavation began, I heard the word ritual. It hit me like a physical blow. The air cooled sharply as the sun fully disappeared, shadows reaching long across the ravine. The lights cast everything in stark contrast, bright whites against deep, consuming dark. Hours later, when the remains were secured and the site taped off, the sheriff guided me back up the slope. His hand stayed close to my shoulder, not touching, but steadying me all the same. The cold night wind swept down the ridge with a sharp bite pulling at the loose edges of my jacket. I could feel the dust clinging to the back of my throat, dry and heavy. At the top, the helicopter blades began to turn, sending a low vibration through the ground beneath my feet. The sound rose slowly, a steady thump that grew into a rotating roar. I watched the stretcher boards being carried toward the open bay, each step deliberate, each movement respectful. My breath fogged in front of me, thin and white in the beam of the portable floodlights. When the helicopter finally lifted off, kicking up dust and pine needles in a swirling cloud, I stood there long after the lights disappeared into the dark sky. The sheriff didn't rush me. No one did. The night settled around us quiet except for the fading rumble of the aircraft and the distant echo of radios still murmuring instructions. Eventually he walked me to his cruiser. The interior smelled faintly of old leather and coffee, familiar scents that felt strange against the weight I carried. He said they'd need statements. They'd need to notify Ellen. They'd need to reroute teams for follow-up searches, gather more specialists, widen the investigation. But his voice felt far away. He drove me back toward town in silence, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. I watched the trees blur past their trunks, pale and ghost-like in the beam, each one standing like a witness to something I couldn't yet fully comprehend. When we reached the sheriff's office, the parking lot was lit with a harsh glow from the tall sodium lamps. A few deputies waited by the entrance folders in hand, faces grave. I stepped out of the cruiser slowly, the cool night air brushing against my skin, and realized the night wasn't over. Not even close. The truth had finally surfaced, and now the long, unforgiving part of the story was about to begin. In the first hours after the remains were flown out, the sheriff's office felt like a sealed box of fluorescent light and murmured voices. Deputies moved in and out of the hallway with folders tucked against their chests, the soles of their boots thudding softly on the linoleum. The air inside was cool but carried a faint smell of dust and old coffee, something I'd never paid much attention to before that night. I sat in a small interview room while they recorded my statement, the metal chair cold against my back, the hum of the overhead light growing louder the longer I listened. Each question was asked gently, but the weight of it all pressed down on me until my hands trembled against the tabletop. When they finally let me step outside, the cool Montana night hit my face like a truth I wasn't ready to absorb. The stars above town were sharp and bright, too peaceful for what had just been confirmed. Word spread quickly in Kalispell. By sunrise, every neighbor within 3 blocks knew something terrible had surfaced in the mountains. Some dropped by my house, leaving casseroles or small notes on the porch because they didn't know what else to do. Others called and let the phone ring twice before hanging up, as if giving me the option to ignore their sympathy. Ellen arrived mid-morning, her eyes red-rimmed and shining even before we said a word. She stood in my doorway, hands clasped together so tightly, her knuckles blanched, and for a long moment we just breathed in the same slow rhythm like two people leaning on each other to keep from falling. We didn't try to speak. Some grief is too large for words, especially in those first few hours when the mind is still resisting the shape of what happened. The days that followed felt strangely suspended, like the air had gone still, waiting for something else to break. The state investigators took over the case, and soon the ravine was fenced off, guarded by deputies who spoke in quiet tones and avoided eye contact when they saw me. Men and women in dark jackets combed through the dirt with gloved hands, lifting out objects that seemed like they belonged to another century. A crude stone blade, a pair of old-fashioned metal pendants, and lengths of rope woven from fibers no one could trace to the region. Each item added a colder layer to the truth. These weren't remnants of hikers who fell or got caught in the weather. Someone had taken my daughters from the world intentionally using methods pulled from beliefs far older than any of us understood. The name that surfaced next, Daniel Hogue, came from a stack of old ranger reports, each one noting sightings of a reclusive man living deep off-grid near the park's eastern edge. He was known for building shelters in the backcountry, leaving small animal traps in places far from legal hunting zones. People had chalked him up as a loner, an eccentric woodsman who kept to himself. But when investigators searched his forgotten cabin, they found a map peppered with red marks, matching unsolved disappearances dating back decades. They also found drawings, rough hand-carved images of a skull split by a crack down the center, the same shape that had been burned into the rib bones of my daughters. And they found a journal with a final entry written the same month. Hannah and Claire vanished a line about feeding the land and going into the shadows. That was the last trace of him. He'd slipped out of the world the same way he had lived in it quietly without any intention of being found. The case never went to trial because there was no one to arrest, no one to question, no one left to face justice. Law enforcement classified it as a ritual homicide attributed to an unidentified individual strongly linked to Hogue's property and writings. No official closure, only a conclusion drawn from the weight of the evidence. In the sheriff's final briefing, he spoke carefully, focusing on the facts, but the pain behind his voice carried through the room like a low, steady hum. He'd known my daughters. Everyone in that building had. That made the loss feel personal to every one of them. In the months afterward, Glacier National Park felt different. Trails that once felt welcoming now carried a hush that followed me like a shadow. Even on clear days when sunlight filtered through the branches and lit the ground in patches of gold, I caught myself listening for sounds that didn't belong. Branches snapping where wind couldn't reach, or a momentary echo rolling longer than it should have. When I returned to the ravine months later during a follow-up examination, the air carried the same cold mineral smell I remembered from that day of the excavation. The flags were gone, the gear cleared out, but the earth still looked unsettled, like it held its breath too. I stood alone on the ridge for a long time, breathing the thin mountain air, wishing I could feel them somehow in that space. But the land was quiet. Kalispell changed in its own ways. Some folks avoided certain trailheads. Others whispered old stories in a new light, giving fresh attention to the tribal warnings they'd once brushed off. A few of the younger rangers requested new routes or shifted assignments, suddenly wary of the sections of the park that had always made them uneasy. As for me, I kept to my routines because I needed something solid to hold on to. I still walked the dirt road near my house every morning, the gravel crunching under my boots, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney in winter, the river fog rising like pale steam above the valley floor. Some days I felt almost steady. Other days the quiet felt heavier than it used to, as though the air around me remembered too much. People in town were kind. They spoke softly around me, left space when I needed it, and stepped closer when my voice faltered during conversations. But the grief settled into me like silt in deep water, slow, silent, impossible to fully clear. I found myself rereading the girls' old texts, flipping through their notebooks, lingering over Claire's photos stored in a hard drive the investigators returned to me after everything had been processed. Some images were blurred or overexposed, ordinary mistakes made by someone who wasn't trying to take art, just remembering a moment. Those became the hardest to look at. They felt the most alive. The hardest part wasn't the discovery. It was the living afterward. Waking up to an empty house, making coffee for one, driving past the trailheads where we'd once started hikes together. Even the small things, like the way the porch light glows on a winter night, would trigger a memory so sharp it almost felt like being struck. I learned to let the moments come without fighting them. Grief has a rhythm you can't rush. In time, I started meeting other parents who had lost children in the wilderness. We'd sit together at community gatherings or quiet corners of the coffee shop, hands wrapped around large mugs, sharing our stories without trying to solve anything. There was comfort in that, knowing someone else had stood in that space between wanting answers and understanding none would fully mend the break. I've kept their house on the north side of town mostly untouched. Sometimes I stop by to water the few plants that survived those first months. The place still carries the faint smell of old textbooks and lemon cleaner, and every so often a draft will push one of their taped-up wildflower prints against the wall, making it flutter softly like a breath. I imagine them walking through the kitchen, talking over each other about their next hike, planning things they never got the chance to do. It brings me pain, yes, but also a strange kind of warmth. Memory can be cruel, but it can also keep a room from going cold. The investigation files remain open on my shelf. Copies the sheriff gave me after everything was said and done. I don't look at them often. The answers they hold are incomplete, and the ones that matter most exist only in the quiet space between the facts. But sometimes I run my hand over the binder covers, feeling the slight texture of the paper beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the understanding that remembering is its own form of truth. Years have passed now, and the seasons still move through the valley in their old, dependable way. Summers bring the smell of hot pine needles and distant thunder. Autumn settles with crisp mornings and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Winter pulls a thick silence across the land, and spring returns the sound of running water through the gullies. Life continues. But there isn't a day when I don't carry their absence with me. It lives in the quiet moments, the pause before a phone rings, the way light slants through a window, the hush of evening settling over the yard. Every so often I drive up to the overlook above the ravine. I stand there with my hands in my pockets, the wind moving steadily across the ridge, carrying the scent of stone and old pine. The mountains stretch out in front of me, vast and unmoved, holding their secrets the way they always have. And in that stillness, I picture Hannah and Claire walking ahead of me on some distant trail, sunlight catching their shoulders, laughter drifting back through the trees. It's not closure, just a moment of grace I take when it comes. Before I end this, I'll leave you with this one quiet truth. I've learned some echoes never fade, they just settle deeper into the heart, becoming part of the way you breathe. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.